Hello and welcome to Story Radio, the podcast for readers, writers and lovers of literature everywhere. Today we're speaking to Tanya, Kirk and Matt Sangster, who curated the British Library's fantastic show, Fantasy, Realms of Imagination. This is a wonderful exhibition. It must have taken years to plan. Can you tell us more about what inspired it?
Yes, it has taken years to plan because we started it in 2019, which seems like about a million years ago now, pre-pandemic. So it was inspired by the fact that the library had previously done exhibitions on science fiction and Gothic literature, and several of us, I think, always felt that fantasy was kind of a prime subject for an exhibition, and that we had amazing collections and that it was a great time to do it. And so finally in 2019 it got commissioned, and we've been working on it since then, and now it's open finally, which is great.
I guess also slightly inspired by your childhood reading and these sorts of things.
Yeah. I think it's a genre that people feel a real emotional connection to, because a lot of people did read fantasy as a child, and that's something that we really wanted to get across in the exhibition, that kind of sense of nostalgia, but also learning something new about a genre that you might not think you read. But a lot of people have said to us, oh, I never thought I was interested in it, but actually I'd read this and this. So that's been really great.
No, I found that myself actually. I was thinking, I wonder, am I actually more of a fantasy fan than I realised, because, sort of so many of the authors that you talk about in the exhibition were authors I loved and admired, and so yes, that's very, it's just interesting. Brings me on to my next question really, which was how you define fantasy as a genre. It's such a sort of huge topic. Have you changed your view of it in any way since you started planning the exhibition?
I think we decided in the end that we would go with as broad a definition of fantasy as possible. We didn't want to make it really specific. We wanted to be able to bring in great examples from the collections. So we decided that we would very roughly have it as the literature of the impossible, stories of the impossible, which is a definition that does quite often get used. So it differentiates it from science fiction, which is kind of technically possible, but even if it's very improbable. Fantasy also often looks to the past, but not always. There's kind of lots of elements that people can use to define it, but it's a kind of a fuzzy genre, and that's what we wanted to keep it as.
Yeah, there's an argument that it only really emerges as a bookshop category after Lord of the Rings. So you wouldn't see bookshop sections on fantasy in the early 20th century. But then there's also an argument that it goes back right to the sort of earliest myths. It's very unclear how the Sumerians interpreted Gilgamesh, but it looks to us like a fantasy, and it's definitely a lot of early mythology has been sources for modern fantasy. And so in some ways we went with the broader definition because that's what you can do with the British Library's collections. It does have this sort of amazing sort of literary heritage collections, and also the clout to pull in stuff from authors around the world. So we thought we would do the broadest version of fantasy, partly to make people sort of realise that there are lots of the stories they like, while they might not appear on the fantasy shelves, contain elements of the fantastic. It's a broad network or a field with fuzzy boundaries.
The exhibition breaks fantasy down into folk and fairy tales, quests, the weird and uncanny, and portals. And I'd love to know a little bit more about how you chose those themes.
The idea was originally that we would look, the first two sections would look at the kind of origins of fantasy, like its deepest roots and older forms of storytelling. So that was how we ended up with fairy and folk tales, which is the kind of maybe the earliest forms of fantasy that you hear as a child, and that are really old forms, and epics and quests, kind of from the ancient world. And that was getting people to really understand that fantasy is, as Matt was saying, it's a lot older than you might anticipate, and definitely didn't just start with Tolkien. And then we wanted to kind of be able to have these sort of distinct sections that would give people an insight into different aspects of the genre. So the other two sections ended up kind of letting us cover everything that we wanted to cover. So Weird and Uncanny and Portals and Worlds are kind of maybe slightly more contemporary than the first two sections, but they all go back and forth through time and kind of let us explore those themes.
That was the idea, although Utopia snuck into world building in the end, and there's definitely some 18th century stuff in Weird and Uncanny, so we did end up moving further back in time. But yeah, I mean those sections were right there in your original plan before I was involved, so I think those came surprisingly quickly and were surprisingly sturdy right through the process. We never really thought about changing that arrangement.
No, they were in the original proposal in 2019, and quite often sections of exhibitions do get changed, but yeah, as Matt said, these stayed, they worked. So
yeah, the only thing that really got added was the more emphasis on fan culture, with the section right at the end, and then weaving that through the exhibition. But I mean, that was there perhaps implicitly in the plan, but became a more defined thing once we thought about what we wanted the very end of the exhibition to be.
And that's ended up being some of my favourite material in the end, the fan culture element.
A lot of early children's stories, such as the Grimm brothers, they kind of start off as though they're going to be morality tales, but then they kind of just seem to go into this very dark direction. I wonder if you've got any ideas about why that happens.
The morals really get stuck on when they get developed. So those fairy and folk tales are really old in some cases, and really old and from unexpected cultures. There are Chinese versions of Cinderella from well before 1000 AD, and I think they get a bit like fantasy. They get assembled as a corpus at a certain point, so the stories get ordered into a kind of genre, and there are a couple of different routes for that. One is the creation of literary fairy tales, which begins, which one of the major places that happens is the French court in the 17th century, so Perrault and those sorts of things. And Perrault tacks morals onto some of those stories when he adapts them, although he also writes stories that seem more original, although it may just be that we haven't found the roots of them yet. And what the Grimms are doing is collecting older folk and tales, so children's or stories for children and households is the title of the collection, and you can see the process happening over the course of the various editions of the Grimm brothers stories. They start a lot weirder than they end up by the time the final collection comes up. So there's a series of cleanings up that go on with those stories in over the 18th and 19th centuries. Although there are always people interested in their weirder forms, there's always the sort of implicit problems in those stories. And I think that comes across in the 20th and 21st century interpretations, both versions that go back and try and pull some of the old weirdnesses out, and some of the versions that find things that would have previously been considered completely acceptable to be strange. So the rights of the kings and princes to rule in the stories are often challenged in modern interpretations, or the idea that marriage should necessarily be where they're going is often subverted in modern versions of things like the Snow Queen.
Yeah.
Yes, because there's very grim stories like Cinderella's sisters had to dance in boiling hot iron shoes, didn't they?
Yeah.
In one of the original versions.
Yes,
I remember that impressing me as a kid.
Quite a lot of early ones. Red Riding Hood does not survive. Gets definitively wolfed towards the end of that story.
You have some wonderful books and artefacts here from the British Library's collection, such as Mervyn Peake's manuscripts with their beautiful illustrations, and Charlotte Bronte's tiny storybooks that she wrote as a child. Could you both talk me through a few of your favourite exhibits?
Yes, there's so many. I'm really fond of the tiny Bronte miniature books, and we've got quite a few in the exhibition in the end, because I would not stop at one. So I think there's 4 items. From their collections, we've got Branwell Bronte's map of Glasstown, and then a kind of historical book about Glasstown that he had written, and then 2 by Charlotte. And I think they're such amazing special items. They've got in this kind of teeny tiny print that you can't even imagine how they wrote them, especially in candlelight, or
they're almost impossible to read.
Almost impossible, but it's actually very clear writing. It's just so tiny. Those are incredible. We also were really astonished that we knew that we had some G.K. Chesterton manuscripts, and that one of them related to The Man Who Was Thursday. And then when we ordered it up to look at it, it in fact is almost 100% drawings, and they're really good drawings. So it's only G.K. Chesterton kind of like almost storyboarding the novel, as far as we can tell.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that perhaps did surprise us. We knew that fantasy we'd have a lot of good visual material. We didn't realise quite how much when we set out sort of putting the exhibition together. I think one of the other things that was really stable from the beginning is knowing that we were going to have the ancient map of Fairyland as the first item, just because that is such an incredible sort of, both kind of as shows how much something that we would recognise as fantasy had been assembled in the early 20th century with all those worlds stuck together. And it's just one of those amazing images you can spend ages and ages looking at. The whole curatorial team is very fond of Tove Jansson's version of Gollum, or non-canonical Gollum. We have a lot of affection for that. I love the Piranesi etchings. Now, it was amazing that we could borrow the Piranesi etchings next to Susanna Clarke's manuscript and with her plans and those sorts of things. I was pleased that we could get games and other kinds of material in there. I don't think we had costumes so much in the early planning, but they became a really important part of the exhibition. I love both the sort of fan costumes and the Dark Crystal costumes and the ballet costumes. I'm very fond of that Study in Emerald board game setup, so like a board game adaptation of a story by Neil Gaiman that's drawing on H.P. Lovecraft, who's in the next cabinet, and then G.K. Chesterton, who's in the cabinet further down, and those sorts of things. I think that's got lots of nice connections with the stuff around it, so that's one of the things I'm most pleased with in terms of locating it in an exhibition space with stuff going on.
Absolutely, you can see all the links and sort of kind of, I guess, cross-fertilisation of ideas just walking around, and it makes it really very sort of come alive, I think, in a way that it wouldn't just reading an article or in any other form, really, I don't think.
I think that's also part of why I'm so pleased that we got a lot of costumes in, because I think having those kind of people-shaped elements in the exhibition does really bring it to life, and I think it kind of underscores the fact that performing fantasy has been a thread for a really long time as well, and especially the fan culture at the end that has the live action role playing costumes in it. That's a kind of a new ephemeral form of storytelling that's akin to the kind of oral traditions that start the exhibition off, let's say like fairy tale, folk tale, and epics. It's kind of storytelling in action, and it just really kind of gives you more of a human element.
Yeah, I guess quite one of the things we wanted to show was sort of not like individual great fantasy works isolated from one another, because that doesn't really how fantasy works. It's sort of people responding to a series of tropes and traditions and ideas. So we wanted Thomas the Rhymer next to the original Ballad of the Burnt Leaves, or not the original ballad, one of the earliest writings with the Burnt Leaves next to Ellen Kushner's notes for her performance of Thomas the Rhymer. Those sorts of pairings were really important to what we were hoping to achieve, those sorts of connections, and sense that fantasy is something that lots of people can pick up and do interesting new things with, and then return to the common stock, but with able to do things it couldn't do before.
It's kind of continuity, but it's also constantly being transformed and made new, and that's something that I think we all really loved working on.
Yes, and I think some of the excitement of that, the kind of openness of the genre comes across as well in the exhibition. The
Piranesi I find interesting, because he's using a kind of impossible geometry, isn't he, which is very influential. And Graham Harmon's written quite a lot about how Lovecraft really pushes metaphor to its limits. It's just interesting in what other techniques you've kind of discovered as part of developing the exhibition and how they work for the audience in pushing the bounds of fantasy writing.
Quite a lot of our authors who we interviewed in the exhibition say something along the lines, fantasy is a means of lying to tell the truth. That's sort of, I think that one of the really core techniques is exaggerating something or changing the world to make you think about how the world actually is. So that comes up a fair amount. We didn't know quite how many of our authors were artists, as I said. We had no idea that Le Guin's manuscripts were so heavily illustrated, or that the Coraline Notebook, Neil Gaiman's Coraline Notebook, is so heavily drawn on. So that sort of sense of that interplay of visuality and textuality in fantasy seems to be more universal than we thought. I guess you might have intuited it from the Little Fantasy's love of maps and from those sorts of things, but the idea that it can be a sort of multi-sensory form playing on that, or describing things in that way, even when primarily text.
I got really obsessed with the mechanisms of world building and how people make these invented worlds seem real to us and let us kind of fully immerse ourselves in them, and that it's not just a kind of a simple case of saying, oh well, it's this is the map of the alternative world, and now you're immediately you believe everything about it. You know, you have to kind of build like magic systems and languages and a whole massive backstory of cultural development in that world, and people put so much more work into it than often it is kind of surfaced in the actual final item. And it's kind of like a proper craft, isn't it? It's something that writers enjoy, but as readers we get so much out of it as well.
Yeah, well, sometimes also they don't, and I guess that's one of the things. Like there's lots of different ways that fantasy is tricking you to be a collaborator in the building of the world. So sometimes it will be that they're giving you this sort of tiny fragment of the surface, this enormous sense beneath. But if you talk to fantasy writers, they will sometimes admit that they know very little about the world beyond what they put in the text. They're just very, very good at putting in those resonant details that makes you do the work of constructing the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why fantasy often has these really passionate fan cultural engagements that suggests all sorts of things outside the text that then there's the tendency to want to fill in or to try and play in that space, or those sorts of things. So I guess that sort of fantasy can be very suggestive in all sorts of ways, like, and very elusive. It's often like sidling up to questions or making suggestions or those sorts of things. Always trying to give the impression of more beneath the surface, even if sometimes there is tons there and sometimes there isn't.
Yeah. So the world building is a major part of the appeal, do you think, of fantasy writing?
Of doing the actual writing.
Well, we're doing the reader doing the work of the world building.
I mean, that's something I really enjoy, and I find it really interesting that when I pick up a new fantasy novel, something that I've never read before, sometimes I'm immediately like, I don't like the world building, I'm not going to be able to read it. It really matters to me as a reader whether I can kind of feel myself into it, whether it makes sense to me. Yeah.
You had some authors featured in the exhibition who are much less well known today, such as Lord Dunsany. I've never heard of him. Can you tell me more about some of the hidden gems in the exhibition, sort of, lesser known treasures?
I definitely have to leave Matt to talk about Lord Dunsany because I don't know much about him. There are a few. There's quite a few, I think, that have been either forgotten and. Like there's George MacDonald, who's kind of primarily, I guess, remembered for his children's stories. So if anyone has heard of him, they've probably heard of Princess and the Goblin.
And the Back of the North Wind, yeah.
Back of the North Wind. But we've got a manuscript of a very weird adult novel he wrote called Lilith, which is a kind of a metaphysical Christian allegory, dream, fantasy, weird portal novel. It's probably a very bad description of it. I'd be amazed if that many people have come to the exhibition who've read Lilith.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I guess the other thing that often gets lost is those late 19th, early 20th century fantasies, which sort of fall down the gaps, because some of the older fantasies are canonical in various ways, are just seen as being classics, whereas there's a lot of really interesting stuff from that period that was one of the things we'd considered doing, although we couldn't find enough copies to make it work, was to show the whole Ballantine adult fantasy series, which is one of the big series that after Tolkien is successful, people start trying to assemble an older tradition. The Ballantine, as in the United States, are one of the people who do that. So we've got a couple of things from that series. So they publish Lord Dunsany's stories as part of that series. They publish Hope Merleys' Blood in the Mist, which is a really wonderful novel. Merleys is otherwise like a pretty cutting-edge modernist poet. She writes a poem called Paris, but then she writes this kind of fairy story fantasy where the very practical people of Dorimere have kicked the fairies out, but they will keep sneaking back in, and they remain there in place names and in people's memories and in people's desire to be something apart from practical some of the time. We're also able to put in some very like contemporary stuff. We didn't want to just sort of stop in like 1974 or something along those lines. So we put in some really contemporary fantasies we love. My particular favourite is Sophia Samatar's The Winged Histories, which I think is just a wonderful response to the fantasy tradition and to the way that epic fantasies are usually told. It is a story that is set around a war, but it's told not from the perspective of one male hero, but from 4 different women, one of whom is a soldier, one of whom is a singer, one of whom is a socialite. I'm trying to remember what the other useful S is for the other one, a historian, I guess the 4th person is, although there is a neater way that keeps the alliteration.
You were able to include some video games in the exhibition. Can you talk to us a bit about how that worked? Was it ever a controversial decision? Did you have to convince anyone, or was it an integral part of the exhibition right away?
It was always pretty integral.
Yeah, I think Conrad Bodman, who runs the exhibition at the British Library, was very keen that games be in there from an early point. There was a bit of negotiation about what games would go in, and there were some games that we could not in the end get permissions for. There were a lot more games in the first plan. This sort of what's in the exhibition is about 50% of things that were on lists at various points. There was a lot of winnowing down. But I think what we have in there is a decent balance. We've got Does the Dragons and games books and Magic the Gathering, which are some of the core ones. We've also showed some more obscure board games, and then similarly for video games, we've got the micro game commissioned from Fail Better, who've done this amazing sort of interactive fiction world building over about 15 years for their version of a London that fell through the surface of the earth in the 1860s. And then we've also got and then we've also got to show off some of the sort of the games that people really loved. We workshopped the exhibition with my students at Glasgow, and they were insistent that we put Skyrim in it because it had been such an informative experience for them. So Skyrim is indeed in it, and I really wanted to show the kind of beautiful hyper-Gothic environments in Dark Souls. So that is also in there.
I was really worried when we were putting the exhibition together that people would be annoyed that they couldn't play all of the games, which we couldn't do for lots of reasons, but mostly because you can't kind of build in so that everyone spends 5 hours in the exhibition because they would be very tired. Also, it just kind of wrecks our ability to get as many people to see it as possible. So we have one playable game, and then everything else is kind of clips. But I was really pleasantly surprised that actually people didn't seem to be annoyed by the fact that they couldn't play them, and they were just kind of pleased to see that they were included. And there's been a lot of comments, especially about the Dark Souls 3, the huge projection of the kind of Gothic architecture, that people have just kind of said, oh, it looked so beautiful, and it really does. So it really shows the kind of craft that goes into developing those games as well.
I was very pleased that we could put Planescape Torment in, which is one of my favourite fantasy stories with no qualifiers. Very old game now, so it couldn't be projected in vast form, but it's there. It's there on a little screen, and for the people who want to see it.
Yeah, the mythic journey as formulated by Joseph Campbell has been very influential on Quest films and more in the broader Hollywood films. I wondered if it had a similar impact on the structure of video games, or is there a different form that they use?
I think to some extent, although games, the sort of the point is to give the player a certain kind of agency, and sometimes that can be taking them quite carefully through a very neatly told story, and often then that will use something resembling the Campbellian hero's journey or the Hollywood 3-act structure because they're very satisfying structures. Although of course games are vastly longer than films, so you've got all sorts of careful stretching out or phasing that doesn't necessarily fit things. There are also some rather sort of problematic bits of the Campbellian hero's journey that modern games will often drop. It's like kind of an interesting toolkit, but also it's a difficult concept. If you read the beginning of The Hero with 1,000 Faces, it begins basically by racially stereotyping a load of people and then saying all their stories are basically the same thing, which I can tell you about. So I think one of the things is that not all stories are the same. They might have strong resemblances, but their particular cultural inflections are important. And I think similarly, like some games will want to tell you a very direct story, but other games will want to drop you into a world with very little explanation, have you wander around, and still other games will have you try and build a civilization which will have a different kind of story behind it. So I think that those structures, those sort of effective story structures, that sort of sense of what a good ending might be and what and a sort of satisfying process to get there, are draw on similar sorts of ideas, but games can take other shapes and can subvert those expectations in various ways. The sort of Dark Souls is very good at hiding what has happened in the world before from you, and like it has an enormous fan community who interpret all the tiny fragments and bits and pieces, but that happens almost outside playing the game. So the experience of playing the game is about not being quite sure why you're being directed to do these strange acts, and to defeat these sort of ruins of a sort of older world that has fallen away, those kinds of things. So I think there's I mean, a lot of times fantasy, yes, they're playing with core tropes and playing with that core journey that we all have a sense of, but also like subverting it and telling it from different angles and those sorts of things. I think games like other forms of fantasy are always interested in doing that, like tell it with a twist.
Yeah.
I always just like playing the games that you can just do endless side quests
Mm.
and like, go and find some weird thing to help someone and not actually fulfill the main.
Yeah, there are people who've played Skyrim for hundreds of hours and
Yeah.
never done the main quest, and I sort of
Yeah.
think games have that sort of it's there, but you don't have to do it. You can go do something else, find your own story.
Terry Windling talked about fantasy taking you into the darkness where you face tests to find out the truth about yourself. The whole area of fan fiction and that involvement intrigues me, and I just wonder why fantasy, as opposed to other fictional forms, seems to particularly generate that participation.
I think it's partly the spaces in the world building that we were talking about before. I mean, and those spaces can take different forms, like sort of in some of the big fandoms, it's like that like there's gaps where you get to see the characters doing the central plot, but people want to see them like hanging out. So you write those stories where the characters hang out. In other cases, it's these, and I think this is something that Terry's particularly interested in because she's got a deep, like, an abiding interest in fairy tales and how they're told, is the fact that those stories are kind of sparse. You can tell a lot of fairy stories over 2 or 3 pages. She's very interested in what's not told and those gaps and what happens when you flesh them out, as she does in The Woodwife, and she encouraged a whole series of writers to do when she was editing in the 80s and 90s, that she would ask people what happens if you stretch a fairy story out to a novel and you change these archetypal characters into people. I think that's what a lot of people see in fantasy, that there are these more archetypal figures, and they sort of think, well, what would that person be like if we flesh this out a bit more, if we put them in a different situation, or those sorts of things. So it gives you these kind of resonant things in which you're invested, but then asks you to take them out, put them in different contexts, expand on them, those sorts of things, and it gives you the tools for doing so by suggesting different environments.
I think isn't that what's really satisfying about genre fiction full stop, is that it gives you these kind of building blocks that you can make a whole new house out of every time, but that people will kind of enjoy seeing how you've done it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That it's always the story changes every time you tell it, because you are telling it rather than someone else, or the context you're telling it in is different, or the audience you're telling it to is different. But there's also stuff in sort of those stories that is sort of deeply resonant. Like there's a really wonderful Jorge Luis Borges quote about how the sort of street corners in Buenos Aires will change, but the experiences of nightmares or fears or those sorts of things, or being stuck in a maze, communicate more broadly. And so that's why he moved away from writing slightly more realistic stuff early on to writing these more archetypal stories.
Yeah, a few of the interviewees discussed the use of fantasy to kind of give the audience a message when their defences are down, and there's been kind of satirising of contemporary attitudes and oppressive regimes and the presentation of utopian visions. I was just interested in, maybe you could kind of tell us some particular authors that impressed you with their presentation of controversial ideas under the cover of fantasy.
I think maybe the best examples of that are N.K. Jemisin and Victor Laval in the section that looks at Lovecraft.
Yeah, and I think that's true, that Lovecraft is sort of a strong and abiding presence in genre, but was also a deeply racist and unpleasant person in all sorts of ways. So people often pick up his terrible horrors and turn them around in various ways. Think about the people who get excluded in his stories and put them in the centre, as in Victor Laval's The Ballad of Black Tom, or effectively set up the Lovecraftian intrusion as a kind of process of gentrification and microaggression and those sorts of things, which is what N.K. Jemisin does in The City We Became. I guess there's a lot of older examples in the exhibition as well. While Mikhail Bulgakov does not succeed in getting The Master of the Margarita through the Soviet censors, that story is told as a fantasy because it can do forms of critique with the fantastic that would not be possible in realism. And also because writing a fantasy in the Soviet Union where there's a dominant kind of social realism is itself kind of a form of protest.
And Franz Kafka, I guess, a similar...
Yeah. I was going to say, yes, the metamorphosis. And,
yeah.
I think a lot of the fairy tale retellings do that as well. They take these stories we're very familiar with, but from older versions and from the Disney versions. Although, to be fair, even Disney is doing this sort of subversion of the standard patterns, thinking about who gets to be heroines and those sorts of things. And sort of... So it's a way, really, of thinking about how our cultural values are changing. We take these older stories and you run through the scenario, you think about what's uncomfortable for you in it, and you change those things, or you modify those things, or you make those things into problems and use that to think about how the story could turn out differently, to turn out to have the space for you or for people like you.
I was struck by the quote by Neil Gaiman where he was talking about fantasy not really being seen as part of the literary canon, being a bit of a sort of, not really being sort of invited to the, literary party, but sort of slightly kind of, outside. And I'm just sort of wondering, do you think that's changing? Do you think people are now sort of understanding the sort of incredible artistry in the genre of fantasy?
I definitely think it is changing. I think people are taking it way more seriously now, and I mean, I have often been really infuriated that fantasy gets shelved under science fiction in bookshops when it's not the same thing necessarily. But also there's people who write what you could consider fantasy that's kind of also seen in bookshops as mainstream fiction. So like Piranesi by Susanna Clarke is a really good example. It's to me very clearly a fantasy book, but it hasn't been marketed like that. I find the whole question of like whether we should just get rid of genres really interesting, because I've heard people argue that we should just abolish them and then no one should kind of be pigeonholing anything. I think that would be quite sad though in a way, because there's lovely things about genre too.
Yeah, and one of the things that makes a fantasy good is the way that it's responding to other fantasies. I think that's why I like... One of the reasons I like fantasy is because the works are not pretending that I am this solitary, terrible thing that one brilliant mind has made and unconnected to other brilliant minds. That it's part of an ongoing conversation. I think that's actually a better model for thinking about culture more broadly. That's really how everything works. No work is an island.
It's like super intertextuality on another level.
Yes, there's a science fiction critical term called the science fiction megatext, which is all the bits of science fiction connected together. But you could really expand that to a sort of whole cultural megatext. And I think fantasy is a really important part of that. I mean, in some ways, like, you could point to this exhibition at the British Library, which, if there is a national cultural arbiter, it's certainly a good sort of place to point to for that is having the fantasy exhibition, and in doing so has found like sort of all of these things in this connection, some of which were fantasy. I think they're pretty clear when the Peak Archive was bought, that was being bought as the archive of a major fantasy writer, but also some of the older collections. It appears in all sorts of peculiar places once you start sort of digging through the BL's riches.
Yeah.
What's the future for fantasy, do you think? I mean, I can see games as an obvious direction. I suppose I'm thinking about AI or virtual reality, although people stopped talking about that quite so much recently, I've noticed. But I'm sure there are sort of strange directions that it could go in.
I think there's many directions, but I do. One thing that I have found really interesting in recent years is that there used to be this perception that it was kind of a genre for men and that it was all about battles and like being a man. And now there's a huge subgenre, romantasy, which is like fantasy romance, and most of the people, not all the people, but a lot of people who are buying that are women, and fantasy can do both those things really well. It can do kind of very gendered stuff. It can do stuff that's nothing to do with that.
I think it's moving away from there's a kind of a default setting for fantasies after Tolkien, which was kind of basically a version of medieval Europe, although I mean, Tolkien himself is more complicated than that in mixing up like his basically Edwardian hobbits and his kind of medieval people of Gondor and his Anglo-Saxon Rohirrim and these sorts of things. So you could always, it was clear, like if you were looking carefully, you could always mix in a whole lot of different things. But there's been a real push to move away from fantasies that are solely based on medieval European culture and to think about what Regency fantasy or Victorian fantasy might look like, and also to think about fantasies based on other world cultures or on combinations of other world cultures. I think that's been a big trend. I think one of the things that the more sort of obvious existence of fan fiction has done is make people think about different kinds of story shapes. People do like in fan fiction to tell these stories about characters having a pleasant time together, and there now seems to be a bookshop genre of cozy fantasies that are playing into that.
I've heard of cozy fantasy and romantasy. I was quite. It was a little bit controversial, wasn't it? Because Goodreads took the decision to add romantasy as a category in their literary prizes, and remove, I think it was poetry, and
did they remove
they removed poetry and children's fiction. It's like, can't we have all the nice things?
Yes, it does seem like an odd decision. Although I guess like genres do sometimes end up radically changing. You think about the size of the horror section in the 90s and the sort of, it's been slowly being chipped away and maybe replaced with, or at least partially replaced with, paranormal romance for a while. So I don't think I think fantasy is an old form and has a sort of greater stability, but genres do tend to wax and wane. I think it also depends a little bit on forms. I think fantasy has always been really central in animation. Just the things that animation can do are really important for fantasy. And similarly, partly because of the rule systems of RPGs, it was a very obvious way of creating games early on, so it's become quite central to games. It's been like sort of perhaps less prominent in live action film. It's depending on how you think of superheroes, it's a kind of experimental space in comics rather than the mainstream. So I guess sort of there's a lot of interesting things that could be done with different forms. I think one of the things that will definitely happen is that those things will happen more and more in networked communities of various kinds. That's been the really big change in some ways, where fandoms were previously local or the quite enfranchised people who go to conventions. Now the barrier to entry across the world is a lot lower. So you've got a lot more people feeding into what fantasy can be, writing fan fiction, moving from writing fan fiction to producing published works or reaching wider audiences. So I think that's probably one of the things that's changed. Like who can do fantasy hopefully has broadened out, and that should see changes in the genre as more and more backgrounds get represented in it.
My son writes fan fiction, but I'm not allowed to read it.
I think it's probably a mercy.
Well, I think this is the thing about fan fiction, that one of the nice things is being able to practice in a space where you're not like looked over in quite the same way, with that sort of series of tags and conventions and like have your comments on and those sorts of things. So you can, I think even like really established writers often use fan fiction as a space to learn. As a really lovely anecdote about N.K. Jemisin being a bit unsure how to do that second person voice that she uses in the 5th season, which she does wonderfully, but she practiced it apparently by writing fanfiction in the second person first to work her way into that voice.
Plus you get instant feedback, don't you, as a writer for doing fanfics. So you put out a chapter and then everyone comments and says, but why this? And shouldn't he have said that to her? And
which
so
I guess is like the experience that Dickens had when his
novels
were being serialised.
I think that is a thing, that like rather than fantasy being, and I think that's changing in games as well. A lot of games have sort of developed sequentially or through a series of open betas or parts are built. So fantasies might be, I think there'll always be a place for like the book like that you have never come across before, reading that, but works that you live with, sort of serialized comics or these really long fan fictions or long sort of online works. Like there are a number of multi-million word online fantasies, and some of them even longer than the long published series. So, and that's the thing that some people really want. They want a book that they can go and read like a new chunk of the end of every week or something along those lines. So, and you can do that now in a way that you couldn't before.
Thank you so much to both of you. This has been such an interesting discussion, and I just want to say to our listeners, you must go and see this show if you possibly can. It's so thought-provoking, and it's a treat for the eyes as well, because of all the amazing, beautiful imagery that you can see in it. Just wonderful and so thought-provoking.
It runs till the 24th of February?
25th of February, yes.
And finally, Tanya, I know you've been involved in the British Library's excellent Tales of the Weird imprint. I'm a big fan. You source forgotten classic ghost stories for collections, I believe.
Yes. So this started about 10 years ago.
I hope it was on a cold, dark night.
Yes. The library having obviously huge quantities of stories, including lots of kind of forgotten Victorian periodicals, which were a huge kind of breeding ground for short stories. We thought it would be a really great way of bringing these back to life and republishing them. And so I have done the Christmas volumes of Tales of the Weird, so there's 4 so far.
4 of them?
Yeah.
Goodness, wow.
I got a year off this year because of fantasy, so I didn't have to do one this year. It's always very weird because I always have to do them in the summer so that they'll be ready for Christmas. But yeah, the most recent one is Haunters at the Hearth, which came out last October.
Wonderful. Now, have you chosen an extract?
I've got a bit. So this is from the first collection I did, which is Spirits of the Season, Christmas Hauntings, and the story is called The Curse of the Catafalques, I think I would pronounce that, by F. Anstey, which was first published in 1882 in Cornhill magazine. So F. Anstey was the pseudonym of a writer called Thomas Anstey Guthrie, who died in 1934, so he's out of copyright. And it's a kind of a send-up of a Gothic story, I guess. So the setup is this guy, the hero of the story, has met someone on a boat from Australia who's coming over to get married, kind of an arranged marriage, but will inherit a great inheritance if he goes through with the marriage. But he doesn't want to go through with the marriage for reasons that aren't very clear. And so the hero decides that he will offer to be a substitute and pretend to be this guy. So he rocks up at the house of the Catafalques family and is quite confused about how grateful they seem to be that he's there to go through with the marriage. And they break to him that on Christmas Eve he will have to go and present himself at the Grey Chamber and face the curse of the Catafalques. So this is Christmas Eve. We dined almost in solemn silence. Sir Paul made no remark except as he saw my head approaching a decanter, when he would observe that I had need of a clear head and strong nerves that night, and warn me to beware of the brown sherry. Chlorine is the fiancée, hilariously named, Chlorine and her mother stole apprehensive glances at me from time to time and sighed heavily between the courses, their eyes brimming with unshed tears. It was not a lively meal. It came to an end at last. The ladies rose, and Sir Paul and I sat brooding silently over the dessert. I think both of us felt a delicacy in beginning a conversation. But before I could venture upon a safe remark, Lady Catafalque and Chlorine returned, dressed to my unspeakable horror in readiness to go out. Worse still, Sir Paul apparently intended to join them. "It is now time to say farewell," he said in his hollow voice. "You will need a season of self-preparation. You have more than 3 hours yet. At midnight you will go to the Grey Chamber. You will find the curse prepared for you." "You are not all going," I cried. I had never expected this. They were not a gay family to sit with, but even their company was better than my own. "We must," they said. "'Tis one of the traditions connected with the curse. No human being but one must be in the house during the night appointed for the interview. The servants have already left it, and we ourselves are about to pass the night at a private hotel after a brief visit to Madame Tussauds, to allay, if possible, our terrible anxiety." I believe at this I positively howled with terror. All the old fears came back with a sudden rush. "Don't leave me all alone with it," I cried. "I shall go mad if you do." Sir Paul turned on his heel with a gesture of contempt, and his wife followed. Chlorine remained behind for one instant. I had never thought her so pretty before, as she looked at me with a yearning pity in her pale face. "Augustus," she said, "show me I was not mistaken in you. I would spare you this if I could, but you know I cannot. Be brave now, or you'll lose me forever." I felt a stronger determination to win her then than I had ever done before. Her gentle appeal seemed to make a man of me once more, and as I kissed the slender hand she held out to me, I vowed sincerely enough to prove myself worthy of her. Almost immediately after that, the heavy front door slammed behind them. The rusty old gate screeched like a banshee as it swung back with a hollow clang. I heard the carriage wheels grinding the slush, and I knew that I was alone, shut up on Christmas Eve in that sombre house, with the curse of the catafalques for my only companion.
Wow,
Thank you.
fantastic! Thank you so much.
Chlorine never really caught on as a name.
It was very difficult to say.
Oh, that was brilliant.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. That was
Yeah,
wonderful
it's
and really great to meet you all, and just to hear
thanks for coming
more
in.
about the exhibition.
Absolutely.